Have you noticed how the light has begun to change since the autumnal equinox? Yesterday, during the Worship Associates training, the check-in question was, what is the spiritual weather report in your life right now? Is it blue skies smiling at me? Or maybe it's stormy weather. Or perhaps it is a blustery day and you'd like a gentle breeze. Or maybe you feel weary of an unrelenting sun and need a little downtime. This seasonal change, however much or little the weather actually changes, is an opportunity to find a sense of balance. With all that life brings our way, it can get a bit overwhelming sometimes, adjusting to new schools, new schedules, new jobs, new retirements, new diagnoses, new medications. The news itself changes. Losses, death. Several of us are dealing with many of these things all at once. Sometimes you might have a sense that you feel like you might be beginning to falter, just barely controlling the chaos of schedules and appointments and drop-offs and pickups and errands and stuff, wondering how you can hold all the sadness, all the anxiety, all your worries, wondering if you are enough for your partner, your kids, your pets, your work or school, or simply, are you enough for this moment? I certainly worry about trying to keep all the things I'm juggling up in the air. How to keep getting out of bed when the news of the violence in the world makes me want to withdraw and snuggle my spouse and small shy dog. I certainly grow weary having to grapple with the projections from others that try to shroud who I really am. What I long to do is focus on my heart's calling to manifest more love in the world and to join with others who want to do the same. Writer and spiritual teacher Parker Palmer said, "Our deepest calling is to grow into our authentic selfhood, whether or not it conforms to some image of who we ought to be. As we do so, we will not only find the joy that every human being seeks, we will also find our path of authentic service in the world."
In the first half of 2016, I participated in a small group from this congregation called Beloved Conversations, a curriculum exploring issues of race and racism in our society and in our congregation. I have to confess that I was more than a little confused at first. Don't we have more pressing problems in our congregation than racism? Is there value in a group of mostly white people talking about race and racism? I'm not racist, am I? Fast forward to this week. I found myself hiding from the news. After all, I'm busy. Things at work are busier and more demanding than they've been in a couple years. I have 2 teenage daughters whose schedules are busier than mine with sports and school and all these activities. And life, maintaining friendships, cleaning the house, walking the dog. I'm busy. I really don't have time to watch those videos. The ones I'm talking about. Grainy, chaotic, jumpy, with tragic endings that leave any feeling person in despair. And besides, it doesn't affect my life. It isn't my fight, is it? Can't I just ignore the whole damn thing? Sadly, I have a choice to ignore it, to hide from it, to not see it, to not try to understand it. That is the privilege that comes with the color of my skin, my gender, and my economic position. And when I do pay attention to my Facebook feed, the conflicts playing out in our society are laid bare. A football player kneels. Is that a black man using the privilege of his position to shine light on injustice? Or is he a traitor? Are the protesters in Charlotte righteous in their anger? Or are they criminals undeserving of the welfare and food stamps that some say they must be receiving? How can we move forward if we can't even agree on a common understanding of these events? Today we reflect upon the life and accomplishments of Frances Ellen Watkins Harper. As Unitarian Universalists, we can be proud to claim her as one of our ancestors. A black woman, born free on September 24th, 1825. Orphaned at the age of 3 and working as a seamstress at the age of 13. And ultimately, she was a poet and a novelist, an abolitionist, a public speaker, an advocate for the rights of women, and more. She worked on the Underground Railroad, sending those who escaped slavery on their way to Canada. I had to believe that she jeopardized her freedom and her life doing all this. As a free black woman, I wonder if she ever asked herself if fighting slavery was really her fight. During one of her speaking tours in 1851, she became gravely ill. She wrote, "Bury Me in a Free Land." The poem describes the horrors of slavery. The last stanza reads, "I ask no monument proud and high to arrest the gaze of passers-by. All that my yearning spirit craves is bury me not in a land of slaves." Our ancestor Frances Ellen Watkins Harper calls me to lean into my discomfort. She calls me out of my privileged place and inspires me to see the injustices committed, to watch those horrible videos without turning away, to say their names aloud. Terrence Crutcher in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and Keith Scott in Charlotte, North Carolina. The tragic list of names that gets ever longer. To acknowledge that this has been happening since long before it could be captured on video. I say this at risk of being misunderstood. I'm not assigning blame to all police. Sadly, I know there have been attacks on police officers in Dallas and other cities. I remember the sacrifice of Detective Mike Davis in Auburn just 2 years ago, who gave his life protecting this community. And CHP officer Nathan Taylor, who died this March after being hit by a car near Donner Summit. There's no doubt that police work is dangerous and stressful. But my UU heritage calls me to hold all these uncomfortable truths. It calls me to acknowledge the many privileges that I have been afforded. It calls me to raise my eyes and see the world for all it is, full of beauty and the possibilities of love, and full of tragic injustices that all too frequently claim innocent lives. It calls me to discern a response that I have not yet found. And I'm grateful to have heard the call here in community with you. The voices of racism, violence, and fear are loud. The actions that will lead to the destruction of our planet seem impossible to stop. But perhaps our UU heritage calls us to discern a response together.
What would that shared response look like? Sound like, smell like, feel like, taste like? What would each of our individual commitments look like if we were willing to lean into what we don't know? To lean into the discomfort of being and doing something differently in the challenges we face? With the election coming, I'm feeling increasingly worried about what is going to happen. Is anyone else feeling that way? Yeah. I can get overwhelmed by the magnitude of all the problems, the way that we are destroying the earth, the use of violence rather than communication to address our conflict, that ideas are somehow dangerous. Simply thinking differently than someone can land you in a life-threatening situation. Frances Ellen Watkins, a black woman in a country that was deeply invested in enslaving people, trying to erase other people's worth and stripping them of their dignity. She decided to listen to her heart. In her teens, she began to write poetry. Her poems appear in newspapers, and in 1845, a collection of them was printed as Autumn Leaves, also published as Forest Leaves. That book is now lost to us. Polly Peterson, in her book about prophetic Unitarians and Universalists in the 19th century, shares the next part of Miss Frances's journey. She writes, while she considered what to do next, events in her home state gave her a new aspiration. Maryland passed a law saying that any free person of color who entered the state would be arrested and sold into slavery. Frances Watkins heard about a young man who unwittingly crossed into Maryland and was sold to a Georgia slaveholder. He escaped, but was recaptured and sent back to Georgia, where he soon died. Watkins wrote to a friend, upon that grave I pledged myself to the anti-slavery cause. So what is your heart calling you to be? To do? Does anything come to mind when I ask you that? What is your heart calling you to be? To do? Do feelings arise in you when you hear that question? Does it feel too late to start? Are you too tired to continue the path that you are called to? Are you worried that you don't yet know enough or have the right skills? Are you excited at the prospect of what just popped up for you in your mind or the way that you are already living? Are you giving yourself a hard time right now because you can't hear your heart? Let all that go. And just listen. What is your heart asking you to be? To do? Perhaps your responses are similar to that baseball ban. Maybe you wouldn't care because you don't like following the whims of your heart anyway. Or maybe you'd play and see if they mean it, and if you'd go to jail for your heart if you had to. Maybe you'd go to a neighboring state to follow your heart's calling where it's still legal. Perhaps you'd protest in front of the State House and try to reverse laws so that everyone could listen to their heart's calling. Maybe you'll keep your heart's calling secret, sharing only with people you trust not to tell. Parker Palmer, in his book, The Courage to Teach, reminds us that relational trust is built on movements of the human heart, such as empathy, commitment, compassion, patience, and the capacity to forgive. The world needs us to listen to our heart's calling, to risk being who we are called to be and doing what we are called to do. It is up to us to build the relational trust, practicing empathy, committing to one another in the congregation, cultivating compassion for one another and ourselves, increasing our patience even as we might feel urgency, and building our capacity to forgive one another when we make mistakes or hurt one another. Frances Ellen Watkins wrote several books and had many speaking engagements. According to Polly Peterson's book, she donated most of the money she earned from her books to the anti-slavery cause. Whenever she could, she sent a few dollars to William Still for the Vigilance Committee and the fugitives from slavery. At one point, he must have admonished Watkins to keep more of her earnings for herself because she wrote back, "Let me explain a few matters to you. In the first place, I am able to give something. In the second place, I am willing to do so." In fact, she was more than willing and able. To her, helping humanity was a sacred calling. She felt blessed to be able to do it. She said to a friend, "Oh, it is not a privilege if you are sisterless and lonely to be a sister to the human race. and to place your heart where it may throb close to downtrodden humanity. I'm with Andy in guessing that Frances Ellen Watkins was likely to regularly have been in danger, striving to help people to freedom. Whether she was taking part in her public speaking engagements, no small feat in and of itself given her identities, or part of the Underground Railroad, or sending notes of encouragement to folks like John Brown, who was imprisoned for trying to end slavery through an unsuccessful uprising at Harper's Ferry. She once sent a thank you poem to Harriet Beecher Stowe for writing Uncle Tom's Cabin. In 1858, she refused to leave her seat on a streetcar nearly 100 years before Rosa Parks engaged in civil disobedience on that bus. In small and large ways, Frances faced her own fear and the fear in others and spoke her truth and challenged the systems of oppression and inspired justice. She married Fenton Harper in 1860. She would be widowed in 1864. She continued the struggle to abolish slavery and achieve a woman's right to vote and temperance and raising a daughter. So strong was the calling of her heart to be herself and to do what she could. According to the Dictionary of Unitarian and Universalist Biography, in 1870, Frances Harper joined the First Unitarian Church of Philadelphia. Both Unitarians and the African Methodist Episcopal, the AME Church, have claimed Harper as a member. She was reluctant to choose between the two. The AME was the church where she had been raised. It was family and home to her, and she always remembered where she came from and what her people had been through. And her reasons for joining the Unitarian Church, on the other hand, may have been partly political. Although she had had personal and professional contacts in both black and white communities, ever since her first book of poems was published, many doors remained closed to her. In a society where color lines were clearly drawn, a Unitarian church provided a rare opportunity for the races to meet. The Unitarians she knew could help to advance the causes she supported in places she could never go. Now I know that many of us are tired, busy, we're overwhelmed, we're dubious, we're scared. Many of us are suffering from compassion fatigue, unsure how to put our faith into lived action in our lives. Parker Palmer reminds us that the deeper our faith, the more doubt we must endure. The deeper our hope, the more prone we are to despair. The deeper our love, the more pain its loss will bring. These are a few of the paradoxes we must hold as human beings. If we refuse to hold them in the hopes of living without doubt, despair, and pain, we also find ourselves living without faith, hope, and love. When asked what can we do when we are personally or politically heartbroken, Parker Palmer responded that we take sanctuary. We gather with those we love. We remember. We share stories. We sit in silence until we can go on. There is a time for positive action, to do what needs to be done. But there are also times when we rest in the arms of what most sustains us. We take sanctuary. We take sanctuary and rest in the arms of what most sustains us. May this be a sanctuary as well as a launching pad into positive action. We can start by saying hello. Hello to those we pass on the streets, in the grocery stores, in the bleachers at our kids' and grandkids' soccer games, or to people we don't yet know in this very room. We can write thank you notes to people who do brave things, or letters to the editor to decry nonsense posing as facts. We can question the systems that keep oppression and racism in place, and we can take an honest assessment of our own participation in those systems. We can think outside the box towards creative responses that might open hearts and minds. like creating a public bathroom with a beautiful mosaic here in downtown Auburn to serve those with and without homes. Maybe you arrange a meeting of locals to talk about how to organize something to prevent police profiling locally, declaring that Black Lives Matter. What is your heart calling you to be? To do? When the Civil War ended, Harper waged a dual campaign for women's suffrage and civil rights for all citizens. In May 1866, she delivered an address to the National Women's Rights Convention in New York, saying before thousands, "Justice is not fulfilled so long as woman is unequal before the law. We are all bound up together in one great bundle of humanity, and society cannot trample on the weakest and feeblest of its members without receiving the curse in its own soul." Kenny Wiley shared these words in the UU World. Her words in New York laid out her theology and vision for a healthier society. For Harper, the stakes were high and the soul of liberal religion and the nation was on the line. The stakes are high. The soul of our religion and this nation are on the line. And we are all bound up together in one great bundle of humanity. Have you noticed the light? It's changing.